verse 318. Likewise with emancipation, there are 3 forms, 4 kinds of mind streams, 6 kinds of my egolessness, and also 4 kinds of knowledge. Likewise with emancipation. This verse is following on in spirit from the previous one. And the previous one was also consisting of lists. I was listening to a program on the radio recently. It was about bibliomaniacs. I don't know if that was the actual word used, but it was about people that have got a fetish for books. My wife was listening very intently to this because she's trying to get me to get rid of some of my books. She recognised the symptoms. And I must admit, there's something in this. There was a story about a particular writer, I think it was Umberto Eco actually, and somebody had come into his library and commented on all the books and asked the usual question, have you read all of these books? And I think it was Eco. He said, these are the books I haven't read. There's this feeling that even if you haven't read the book, you've still somehow acquired the knowledge that it contains. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because a very similar thing goes on in Buddhism with these lists. Perhaps the more lists you acquire, the more knowledgeable you might feel, the more empowered you might feel. And I think this part of the Lankavatara Sutra, this part of the Sagatakam, the verse summary, is having a little dig at this. It's chucking lists at us left, right and centre. And I addressed this issue in the previous video to do with the 108 doctrines and so on. And in this verse we're told that emancipation, there are 3 forms, whereas a couple of verses later, verse 321, we're told there are 7 forms of emancipation. And in this verse 318 we're told there are 6 kinds of my egolessness. But normally we're told that there are 2 kinds of egolessness. So there's nothing set in stone here. This is the point. This is the first point that needs to be undermined. There is nothing set in stone about these lists. And in fact, we can even get into the spirit of it and start making up some of our own. I've already done this. But the spirit here is, the spirit of the previous verse and of this verse is to look once again at our enlightenment practice. This is the only point. Lists in themselves are completely useless. What we need to be doing is examining our enlightenment practice. First of all, are we practicing? And if we aren't practicing, then we practice. That's it. There may be some obstacles to practicing at that particular moment. We become aware of these obstacles. And in this way, we're practicing. And all these verses here are doing is going into this in some more detail. So we've got 3 forms of emancipation. And in a way, I've just given you the 3 forms. We're either practicing emancipation, or we're not practicing and at the same time realizing we're not practicing. That's emancipating. And thirdly, when we realize we're not practicing, we become aware of this. And in becoming aware of it, we're practicing. So these are the three forms. There are 4 kinds of mind streams. Well, I'd rather suspect this is to do with, in traditional terms, the mind stream of the stream entrant, of the once returner, of the never returner, and of the arahat. And I'm going to look into these in some detail. I'm going to leave that until the last one, the 4 knowledges. It actually is just going to reinforce what I'm going to say now, in the spirit of what I said about the 3 forms of emancipation. There are actually only 2 kinds of mind stream. There's a mind stream that is focused on the apparent reality of conventional understanding, the reality that there's an external world out there, and that there's an individual wandering around interacting with that external world. That's one mind stream. The other mind stream is the one that's practicing, the one that's practicing emancipation, enlightenment practice. Now, that's 2. But what must also go on is the reinforcing. Normally, when the mind is identifying with what we can call the mundane reality, the conventional reality, it gets reinforced. It's reinforced by our moods, it's reinforced by the culture that we live in. So, along with our attention being directed into the mundane, the delusion, samsara, whatever you want to call it, there's a reinforcing of that. Just in the same way that we reinforce our moods. So that's the other mind stream. And when we're practicing, when we're freeing ourselves, there has to be a conscious effort not to go back the other way. That has to be reinforced as well. This is enlightenment practice once again. So there are these 2 directions the attention can go in. One is to delusion, the other is to emancipation, and there is the reinforcing in these 2 directions. One must be strengthened and the other undermined. And as I said, that the more traditional understanding of the stream entrant and so on actually reinforces this, as I hope we'll find out shortly. There are 6 kinds of my egolessness. Interesting that the Buddha says my egolessness and not just egolessness. Well, the Buddha state is the state of the enlightenment practitioner who is practicing, who is successfully practicing. There are normally 2 forms of egolessness here. I mentioned that the attention can go in one of 2 directions, either towards mundane samsara or to the liberation of its own nature, the attention's own nature, which is the nature of pure awareness. But there are 2 factors which prevent this. And one is the belief that this world out there is real. That's reality. That's what we've got to get on with. That's what I have to get on with. I have to get on with surviving in this very difficult and brutal reality. So that's one form of ego, that the world actually has its own reality, its own fundamental reality. And the second form of ego is the more general understanding that I am real. I am a real entity wandering around that real world. I, as a person, am fundamentally real. So these are the two egos that we have to deal with. We have to realize, first of all, the insubstantiality of what we regard as real. The reality of an external physical world, and also the reality of me, individual me. And again, all the tendencies that lend us to believe in the external reality and in the reality of my moods and so on, these have to be addressed. This is the second form of egolessness. And the third form in each case is seeing through these tendencies, triumphing over these tendencies. So the understanding here is that it's a dynamic process. Emancipation is a dynamic process. It isn't something which you blissfully coast along in some kind of cut-off mystical state. The 6 kinds of egolessness are about working with the 2 forms of ego, working with those forces which reinforce them, and finally undermining them and seeing through them completely and being free of them. The 4 kinds of knowledge are the tools that we use. This spells it out in more detail. And as I said, this links into the 4 MindStreams. It's about dealing with these forces which lead us to believe in the ego of the world and the ego of the individual. And the first one is very, very pertinent. I feel this is almost addressed to me personally, because what the stream entrant has to give up is flirting. That's right, flirting. And it's described here on page 103, which is in section 49, and it appears in chapter 2 of the main body of the Lankavatara Sutra. This is what the stream entrant must give up. The world where love grows, that is, the desire for sexual embrace, showing itself in beating, slapping, suggesting, kissing, embracing, smelling, looking sideways or gazing, may give one momentary pleasures, but is productive of future grief. With the stream entered, there is no greed for such. Why? Because they are abiding in the bliss of the Samadhi which they have attained. Hence this casting aside, but not of the desire for Nirvana. This is quite a fundamental thing. I don't know if if this is from a particularly male point of view, although I think women have their own obsession with this kind of thing as well. I think we have to give the translation a bit of slack. I suspect what's described here as beating and slapping is just part of the general canoodling. Now the thing is, let's be quite clear, you don't have to give any of this up. It's just the hankering for it that you have to give up. There's no reason why it can't be enjoyed as part of a healthy, loving relationship. But it's the hankering of it which is not conducive to enlightenment practice. So that's the stream entrant. Now what's this got to do with the egolessness? Because basically it's me here wanting something from out there. And there are many things that me here might want from out there. But this, what I call flirtation, although it sounds quite harmless, it's actually quite a deep thing. It's a deep longing. Perhaps the deepest. Deeper than anything else. Perhaps it's the longing that persists after so many longings have disappeared. So that's the stream entrant. Again, Mahamati, what is the fruit of the once returning? Now the usual teaching is that this is a person that's only got one more life to come back to before reaching Nirvana. It's a completely useless teaching if it's taken literally. But now we're getting some proper understanding here. There is once in them the discrimination of forms, signs and appearances. In other words, they get caught up in the external world once again. But as they learn not to view individual objects under the aspect of qualified and qualifying, and as they know well what marks the attainment of the Dhyana, they once come back into the world and, putting an end to suffering, realize Nirvana. Hence the appellation, once returning. So this is the Enlightenment practitioner once again, who is working with these basic tendencies, the basic tendencies to believe that there's something out there worth getting hold of, something out there which has some intrinsic reality which is missing from here. So it's not a once and for all event. I think this paragraph suggests that it's ongoing as they learn not to view individual objects under the aspect of qualified and qualifying. In other words, we stop believing that something has certain qualities. We stop giving things certain qualities. So this is the second knowledge. And the third knowledge, again Mahamati, what is meant by never returning. This is the one that isn't supposed to come back at all but achieves Nirvana in some celestial realm. But let's get real. It means that while there is yet the viewing of individual objects as characterized by being and non-being in the past, present and future, the discrimination does not return with its errors and faults. The dormant passions do not assert themselves, and the knots are completely cut off, never to return. Hence the appellation, never returning. So this is more from the emotional point of view, the psychological point of view. It's to do with our samskaras, our psychological dispositions, our moods. What this really means is ever increasing liberation from our moods. And the three knots, I'm not going to go into them in detail, but they're the three knots which are cut are the view of an individual personality, the knot of doubt, there can't be any doubt about this, and the holding on to moral practices. And finally we've got the Arahat. This is the fourth knowledge. This is the one who's attained the jhanas, samadhis, emancipations, powers, psychic faculties, and with whom there are no more passions, sufferings and discriminations. Hence the appellation Arahat. And the meaning of arahat here is really the same as bodhisattva, and this is the successful enlightenment practitioner. I've talked about many of these qualities in the past in respect to the bodhisattva, so I won't go into these details here again. The main point here is to give up any fetish for lists, to be real, to come back to that awareness which is aware of everything. That awareness that you're practicing right now as you listen to this